thoughts on Irreversible, a rewatch after almost 20 years, now is quote-unquote the straight cut. This movie that originally went backwards from ending to beginning and has now been recut to a normal sequence of beginning to end. I initially watched the original cut on Netflix when it first launched in Canada. I had the day off and spent an afternoon watching it and immediately felt I needed a shower afterwards. It's a challenging, difficult movie to watch. The first thing I said after it was over was I'm probably never going to watch that again. But at the same time, as unpleasant as this movie was, since I watched it almost 20 years ago, certain parts of it and aspects keep replaying in my head to this day, which to me is a sign of a great movie. And a great movie isn't necessarily something you love, or even enjoy for that matter. So I recently picked up the Blu-ray because over the years since I've seen this movie, I've thought about what it would be like to watch it from back to front in its normal sequential order. The fact that it was in reverse was to me a gimmick at the time, mostly because of Christopher Nolan's Memento, which came out before this movie, and it was revolutionary and put his name on the map. Memento had a similar theme where the protagonist was manipulated into revenge and winds up targeting the wrong person. So that was the one thing I didn't like about the original version of Irreversible, was that it leaned so heavily on the coattails of Memento with way more shock value. Gaspar has now revisited this, his sophomore effort. His first movie was I Stand Alone, which was a brutal movie in itself, but rarely seen, and to this day, it's still quite hard to track down. So Irreversible was his big introduction to the world, and it made all the international festivals and got a lot of buzz, and it featured prominent actors, Vincent Cassel and Monica Bellucci, who were a real couple at the time. The movie was very controversial and had to be released unrated because of particular scenes. So the original cut begins at the end in a brutal act of murder and works its way backwards to a more peaceful time when the lives of these Parisians were normal. So basically the gist of the story in normal sequential from beginning to end is two guys, Marcus and Pierre, and a woman named Alex. They're not so much friends as Marcus is dating Alex, and Pierre is Alex's ex, and the three of them are going to a party. And while at this party, Pierre is constantly telling Alex how much he just adores her and how much he thinks Marcus is wrong for her, and Marcus is misbehaving at this party, and this causes Alex, and when she leaves the party, she makes her way to the metro where she is brutally raped in an underground tunnel. So then Pierre and Marcus later discover that she's been assaulted, and they embark on this savage campaign of vengeance. And to do this, they have to venture into the dark depths of the lower class end of Paris. And what happens is the suspect is a guy who is either bisexual or gay and has a deep hatred for anyone of an upper class. So the act itself is just a complete act of savagery, sadism, and dominance over Alex. And it's a brutal scene that goes on for, I think, maybe 10-12 minutes. It could be longer, and it's the most controversial moment of the movie. But there's another moment that's even as brutal, but in terms of gore and violence, and probably the most realistic murder depicted on screen. So that's basically the gist of the movie, is that these upper class Parisians resort to savagery in order to get vengeance. Yet their own behavior is what drives away Alex to begin with. She literally has to go underground to get to where she wants to go, and that is where these criminals are. And so upon the viewing of the straight cut, which felt a lot different than the original cut because the original starts off with a brutal act of murder and works its way backwards to a normal time, whereas this starts off with a normal time of normal Parisians going about their day and descending into hell, not knowing what's ahead. At the midpoint you get the rape, and then the brutal murder happens at the very end, and it feels more tragic in a way, whereas because of the novelty of the first cut where it works backwards, then you're not so much focused on that aspect. Each sequence, the whole movie is about 7 or 8 scenes where the camera doesn't cut, it's these really long takes and the cameras just moves throughout the scene. You notice how brilliant that was because the actors just do all the work, and there's so much tension that they bring to their roles, and especially Vincent Cassel, you really believe he's wanting to kill someone as revenge. He was really good. So reflecting upon it, since the first time it was such a novelty where there was the shock value, the fact that it was going in reverse, and the long takes, I found myself distracted by that. Whereas this version, if it's a more conventional movie, a more conventional story told in sequential order, that the brutal act of murder happens at the end and nobody wins. What stuck out for me is Marcus' behavior, where he's resorting to doing terrible things, is because of what he thinks are the actions of these low-class criminals, and the fact that they're gay or trans or non-white or immigrants is the reason why his beloved girlfriend is now on her deathbed. rather than his own behavior, but yet the criminal who attacks Alex, he says vile things like that she's a high-class whore, and the more he says, the more angry he gets and the more brutal he gets. So in his mind, his actions are justified because of what society has done to him. So it's a real commentary on French society at the time, which could be the same now. What really is prescient is Pierre and Marcus take out their frustration on immigrants, such as a scene where they take a taxi and the driver is Chinese and they get into a big argument with him and resort to racism. The guys that goad them into getting revenge are also two immigrants. They're either Spaniards or possibly Muslims, and then in the end, they're the ones who are complaining about not getting paid. So the whole movie is more of a real commentary on French society, and that wasn't so much apparent as it is now, to me at least, similar to Cachet, which came out around the same time, so it goes in line with a lot of the French films of that era. These films weren't necessarily horror movies, but really shocking dramas, and this is in that same kind of category as Cachet. And then in terms of horror, there were other movies like Martyrs, High Tension, and these all are really symbolistic, kind of profound movies that will stand the test of time. Now I perceive Irreversible as a relevant commentary on French society thanks to the straight cut, because the original cut when it first came out distracted me. Perhaps other people did get the message at the time, but here we are, and it's a real work of art worth visiting if you can stomach such brutality.